Hello and welcome back to Podcasting is Praxis. I'm James, my pronouns are they and them.
I'm Jamie, my pronouns are he and him.
I'm Rob, mine are he and him.
And I'm Alasdair, my pronouns are also he and him.
And joining us tonight is returning friend of the pod on his second appearance, Josh Sawyer, studio director at Obsidian and game director and narrative director on the recently released Pentiment. Hello, Josh.
Hello, thank you for having me. And for the record, I use masculine pronouns.
Awesome. So no David tonight. David is recovering from New Year's celebrations and will be joining us, I think, next week. But tonight, a bit of a special episode. We've been thinking for a while about art and video games, and specifically about the portrayal of history, which ended up being quite good because we recently played through Josh's most recent game, Pentiment, which has a lot to say on the subject. So we thought we'd invite Josh on to talk about the lens of history and how it's reproduced through art and through video games in particular. So this episode is going to sort of generally focus on Pentiment, but more broadly as a means to talk about these larger questions, which we'll be getting into as the episode goes on. And I say this just to reassure listeners, we will talk about spoilers about Pentiment, but we'll do it towards the end, and we will give a clear kind of jumping off point. In particular, Jamie hasn't finished it yet, so he'll be, stepping aside, and that'll be a good opportunity for any of our listeners who've not finished the game to do so as well.
Yeah. You can just leave.
Yeah, hit the bricks. It's always allowed. So just to get us going, there's obviously a lot to cover here, and just at the outset, we'd like to encourage our listeners to actually play Pentiment. I finished it last night, as I said, and it's a very, very good game. It's a very unique game. I don't think there's anything quite like it, at least in mainstream gaming, in the past few years. If you like games that are thoughtful, in the sense that they require you to think, they inspire you to think, and also they've got a lot of thought put into them. And if you like games which are paced, not slow, but that they're deliberate, and they want you to take your time and really immerse yourself in them, then Pentiment is a hard recommend for me, a 10 out of 10. And
it's also got some really, really enjoyable characters, which...
It does. The writing is quite excellent in places. I really, really enjoyed it. So we're gonna get into it, not too effusively. It's interesting primarily to me for what it does and for the comment it makes, which we'll get into. But yeah, like I said, we'll leave spoilers towards the end. So we're kind of doing this. We figured, obviously, we got you here, Josh. You worked very hard on this, and it's quite an achievement. So I thought, just to start us off, I'd like to ask a question. When did work on Pentiment start, and was it in response to anything in particular?
I guess real work on Pentiment probably started, I would say maybe 2019 is really when we started rolling on it. I think I had some really vague ideas of a game kind of like this in 2018. And I didn't really think it was a thing that we could do outside of crowdfunding, and I wasn't even sure if that would be a realistic route. But then when Obsidian, I should say, was acquired by Microsoft, because they have Game Pass, and they had a stated desire to have a wide range of games, I thought, hey, why not propose a small game that is very, very niche, and rely somewhat cynically on their desire to appear magnanimous and let me do it. So that's kind of my mentality going into it was I probably have one chance to make whatever I want as long as I don't ask for too much money. So I'm going to do it right now. And that's what I did. And then it was, in terms of a response in my own life, I worked on Deadfire, and that was the sequel to Pillars of Eternity. And I have a very sort of very mixed feelings about Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 because they could not have been made without crowdfunding. And the crowdfunding leaned very heavily into the idea of a spiritual successor. But that being said, because role-playing games are pretty conservative as a genre, and because we specifically pitched it as a throwback, I felt very constrained in how I could approach it. and I feel like I did have to compromise a lot to try to make everybody happy, which is usually not a good way to go about things. And even though the first game was both critically successful and commercially successful, the second game was critically successful, but it was not commercially successful. And it was not, I mean, in the long run it was, but in the first year it was a big failure. Like, we wound up spending more money than we expected to, and it sold very poorly. And there were a lot of theories about why, and everyone's an expert on it. But it was very personally upsetting to me. And also, when Deadfire, like 3 months before Deadfire shipped, I started going through a breakup. That was really rough, and it didn't finish until after the game shipped. And it left me feeling very, very unhappy and dissatisfied. So I was like, I don't even know what I want to direct anymore. Or like
I still really enjoyed too. Like, I really enjoyed it, and I still blame you for like making me choose between the 4 factions, because I wanted them all to win and lose at the same time.
Thank you. And the thing is, it's weird because, like I said, I feel like obviously there were some criticisms that I don't think are unfair of the plot, which is largely my responsibility. And other things about the game, like the ship-to-ship combat did not work out. I take less responsibility for that, and I've gone over that before. But like, I wanted to cut the entire system a long time ago. But anyway, so there are criticisms that I thought were reasonable about it. But at the same time, I thought it was a good game, and that it was, in most ways, much better than the first game. And so the fact that it sold very poorly was really frustrating. And I was kind of at a loss for, like, should I make games like this anymore? Should I go back to some other type of game? Should I go back to making, like, a first-person open-world game? Is that even possible anymore? Like, what's going on? And yeah, it wasn't until Microsoft was about to acquire us that I was like, I'm going to try to make a really small game with a really small team with this very specific historical focus. And I think I can do it for an amount of money that no one will care about. So even if it basically, like, I was like, even if it completely flops, like, who cares? Certainly not. I would. I don't think Microsoft would care. Yes. Just because the budget. And that's kind of how I went into it, was just saying, I'm going to make this very specifically the way that I want to make it with my team. Obviously, you have to work with your teammates. You can't just do whatever you want. But without really worrying about who the audience was or, like, making some imaginary group of people happy. It was just done out of passion for the subject matter and the art style and the storytelling, and having the mentality that there is a group of people out here who will want to play it, and maybe that group is very, very small, but I don't care.
Well, from the sound, we have the same approach to our podcast, but your game is much more successful, so congratulations.
Thank you.
I was going to say, Josh, how much of the game would you say did come from your genuine desire to just flee to the Alps in Bavaria?
I mean, I
have a spare room if you want to, like, come hang out in Zurich for a while.
Oh, nice. No, but I do love the Alps. I do love Bavaria. I've talked about this before, but my grandmother was born in Bavaria. Most of my family has either German or Austrian sort of roots, and I studied German language in college and history and music, and I have an interest in it. And I thought it would be a beautiful setting, and I think the history is interesting, and it's a pivotal sort of, I mean, you could say any period in history is pivotal depending on how you look at it, but the early 16th century, the Reformation, the German Peasants' War, I do think those are noteworthy among noteworthy things, and most people don't really know anything about it. So, and they interest me, and so I just thought, put it in a beautiful setting, get some kind of Name of the Rose vibes, but not really. Get a lot of Renaissance, Northern Renaissance art, and deal with some things in history that I think are interesting to me that I hope other people will find interesting.
I do find it really interesting that there's like a sort of a collective mind meld around like the time of the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Peasants' Wars, as you were talking about. Like that there are like several projects. I know Eleanor Janiga, friend of the pod, did a multi-series on it. I know the guys that Matt Chrisman from Chapo is doing like a 10 podcast episode about the 30 Years' War. It's like everybody is sort of figured out that the 30 Years' War is super interesting, and they've all done it at the same time. And did it happen independently, or do you guys just get together in a room, and why are we not invited in that room?
No,
it's fan DM.
Yeah, it's cultural Illuminati and real. Okay, thanks, Rob.
Well, and the thing is, I actually, because I knew I wanted to focus on the first half of the 16th century, the 30 Years' War is like, I actually don't really know that much about it. But it was really that those, like, I also know more about the peasant uprisings in the preceding centuries and how those kind of built toward the German Peasant War in 1525 and how that interacted with the Reformation, and how at the one time people were like blaming Luther for it, and Luther was saying, no, actually the peasants are all scumbags. Like, I never even liked those guys. And the peasants are like, yeah, well, we're not inspired by you. These are issues that we've had for literally centuries. Like, where do you get off thinking like, yeah, we're not even riding your dick. Like, this is not, like, this has nothing to do with you. Like, don't act stuck up. Like, get off of it. So I just thought those interactions were very interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That was just my approach to it.
No, that's all really cool, and it's really kind of interesting to hear like the personal connection to the area that's kind of covered. Because one of the questions I was going to ask was what attracts you to that specific place and period of history, but I think you've kind of covered that pretty comprehensively. So if we step back,
I just want to before we go on, I just want to say what you were saying there about like obviously it's you and the team have put it together, but it's you've done it for yourselves rather than like specifically to a sort of preset audience's wishes or whatever. It really, obviously I've played 7 hours and I've only just like there's only just been a murder. I've just been soaking the atmosphere in. Like it really reminds me of Return of the Obra Dinn. In that same, it's set out to do a thing and it's doing it its way, and you can either get on board or not. You know, it's not like it's not because I enjoyed the Pillars of Eternity games, but if there was any complaints I had about them, it's that they were a little bit too much like Baldur's Gate. I'd like obviously much have preferred to see what you would have done without, like as you were saying, that sort of the weight of history on top of that there, where it was expected to be a specific thing. But yeah, I'm really enjoying Pentiment so far.
Thank you.
Well, that weight of history comment is quite topical, actually, because that's something the game kind of tackles, I think. So to take us from the kind of specifics, because we're gonna talk about Pentiment and like the particular blow-by-blows of the plot and kind of how they expand into the broader theme towards the end. But like just as a kind of to ease us in, what were the kind of big ideas that you wanted to explore in Pentiment? Because obviously there's a lot going on, and I'm not expecting this to cover everything. But like what was the stuff that you kind of looked at and went, I really want to talk about this, or I want to meditate on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things about, I would say, generally art and history as a thing that you live through and you're active in, rather than a thing that sort of happened in the past that you receive. People are participants in history, and in the way that and especially in like a small town where literacy is low, like you're transmitting a lot of things through mouth. You see things in Pentiment that get warped just by Andreas being gone for 7 years, and you come back and you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this is not the way that things happened. I was here. And also the role of an artist or the role of a writer, if you want, like basically the role of chroniclers in portraying things either as they are or as they see them, and that is not a neutral act, and that it's either willful denial or just being naive to think that you can portray things neutrally. And also saying a lot about relationships between people in a community, whether those are literal blood familial relationships or friendships, and the sort of sympathy and empathy that goes on between people living in close quarters for a long time, in a way that maybe we, not to get too nostalgic or trad here, but like, maybe we are kind of alienated from living physically in the way that we do right now and communicating in the way that we do.
I mean, this is a full alienation under capitalism is real and happens kind of podcast, so you're on friendly territory. Yeah.
Okay,
don't worry,
great.
We're not going to teach you being trad.
But yeah, and it was just and also I wanted to kind of explore things that I think are not usually explored in depth. There's a lot of preconceptions that people think a lot of things about history that are bullshit, or there's no evidence to support. History is very fragile, and it's never really a monolith. But we can say, it is sort of factual to say, hey, 16th century European society, broadly speaking, disapproved of homosexuality, and also could punish severely people for engaging in homosexual acts. But also we can say, most people ignored that. Or in a close community, people it was very much a don't ask, don't tell sort of circumstance, and there's lots of evidence to support this. Also, the idea of homosexuality was not a thing that existed in people's minds. Relationships between women were not even conceivable to some people. There's a point where Andreas is talking to Florian during the autopsy, and this is not really a spoiler, but there's some discussion of sex in the abbey, and there are nuns on one side and men on the other, and Andreas can ask, does this happen between the brothers and the sisters? Or he can ask, does this happen between the brothers?
Yep.
The option to ask, does it happen between the sisters, doesn't appear specifically because it's inconceivable to Andreas. He doesn't really understand sexuality in that way, because most people didn't understand sexuality in that way.
I really enjoyed how the game played with the preconceptions and assumptions that the protagonists and those around them had, which is particularly relevant to the central plot in places, but we'll elide that for now. But that's kind of interesting because, one of the things I was thinking as I was playing through this, and this wasn't the overriding thought, but it was in the back of my mind, is that it reminds me, by what it doesn't do and what it does well, it kind of read to me a little bit like a countertext to some of the discourse that emerged around, I think it was 2018, there was that game Kingdom Come Deliverance, which made this whole big thing about how it was very authentic to the history period, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But there was a certain cachet, obviously, of the public with regressive and, shall we say, trad Deus Vult kind of, politics, who seized on it and who were very critical of essentially what we would kind of blithely describe as multiculturalism, but basically just historical representation of people who are non-white. And so it's kind of interesting to me, when I was playing through, it was very interesting how much the game, it didn't go out of its way to do it, but it was inclusive of the kind of things that these people criticized. And I did wonder, because I got to the end, and I saw the bibliography in the credits, which was kind of cool. Very comprehensive bibliography. And I wondered, what was the reason for including this? And was it partially a kind of preemptive, fuck off and do your homework to the sort of, statue-loving people?
To the general player.
I did wonder if there was, an element of that in it.
No, I mean, it wasn't intended as a snobbish thing, although I'll repudiate those people all day long. But it wasn't intended in that way. It was I went to school for history. That's what I got my degree in, and the thing is, back in the 90s, I played a game called Darklands, which I've talked about a bunch, and it's a really fantastic game. And Arnold Hendrick, who sadly died a few years ago, but he was he was the lead designer on the game, and he had a degree, I believe, in military history. And he's a historian, and he included a bibliography, which used to be more common when we had game manuals. But he included a bibliography, and I remember going through it, and there's a lot of really cool reference. And there's things that I used for this game that were in his bibliography.
That's
awesome. I just thought, this is a game that got me interested in history, in part, and I was glad that I could go to the bibliography excuse me, even something like, even though it's not strictly a bibliography, but people will talk about Gary Gygax in D&D. In first edition, he included, I think it's Appendix N, which is all of the things that inspired him in terms of fiction or history in making D&D. And when you go back and look at those, if you actually read through that stuff, you can see the roots and like why D&D is such a weird amalgamation of semi-historical and fantasy things. And so I just thought, why not? I'm doing the work. Why not let people see where I got this stuff from? And so if people are like, was this really how midwives did things? Well, this is where I looked, and this is what I found. Is this really how people would have dressed on a hunt? Well, here's a 1910 text that I referenced. If you want to look at that, and if you think I got it wrong, or if there's some other text, like you can refer me to that, that's great.
Make your own Pentiment.
Make your own Pentiment. And so it wasn't really like, no, it wasn't a snub. It was just, this is the work that I've done, and if you want to check it or do your own, then here's what we did. There's no reason to hide it. And so yeah, that was kind of my mentality behind it.
Yeah, I think that's great, and like I love the fact that you got direct inspiration from a game with its own kind of little bibliography, and that's directly translated into it. It almost perfectly reflects a lot of the themes that are in Pentiment about the transmission across time through art of like cultural knowledge and cultural artifacts. That's fantastic. I really love that. So actually, on the research itself, obviously Pentiment takes pains to give a broadly accurate representation of time and place, like within the bounds of being comprehensible to modern sensibilities. So this is maybe a bit of a naive question, and you might have kind of already answered it, but just for the sake of it, how much emphasis was placed on historical accuracy in development? And in the end, how much do you think that accuracy kind of matters to the public when they kind of play games?
So a high degree, but also we choose what stories to tell, right? So Tassing is not a real place. Kearsarge is not a real place. By constructing a fictional place that plausibly could have existed in this time, in this region, I was able to combine elements of places and people that didn't exist historically anywhere, but could have. So I actually saw a really great Tumblr post by someone who lives in Oberbayern, and they were like, is this a real... Like, they were even thinking, like, is this a real place?
That rules.
And because they're like, the naming sounds right. Like, there's tons of places that are like assing or like whatever ing, like all over that region.
Shout out to fucking.
And yeah, there's fucking. But it is like, I mean, I constructed the name to sound really, really familiar. And it does. Like, lots of Germans and especially Bavarians are like, this sounds like it could be a real place. And Kearsarge also sounds like it could be a real place. And the number of elements, like the person did a fantastic breakdown where they looked at a lot of places, mostly in Oberbayern, but also I think there's like a couple in Tyrol and a couple in Lower Bavaria, where they found, they're like, well, this place has an Nymphaeum, and this place has two saints, and this place has this. And it's like, yes, and I was inspired by all of those, but none of those places had all of those things. So I made a fake place. And but by doing that, I was free to represent things the way that I wanted and tell the story specifically as I wanted. It is a fiction, but I was inspired by Umberto Eco, who the Abbey from Name of the Rose is not a real place, and the Edificium is fantastic, but it's fine. like having a crazy labyrinth library that is the largest library in Christendom, filled with potentially thousands of books, is a fantastic element, but it's also awesome in the story, and I can't conceive of a Name of the Rose without the Edificium. So so being historically accurate was very important, but we're not telling a historical story, we're telling a fictional story set in history. So that gave us the liberty to make certain choices about representation and focus and all that sort of stuff that would have been a lot harder to do if we stuck with like, no, this is a very real place with very real historical people, and we have to cleave exactly to what we know. I think that would have been a lot harder. but we didn't. So, so for example, like one of the things that came up, and this is a really touchy thing, and we discussed it for a while, is like corporal punishment and violence and like spousal abuse and family abuse.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, historically, this is probably going on a lot. Like it's really commonplace. Like one of the things with Lenhart, like we had elements where Lenhart was physically abusive, and not like in gameplay, but it was like part of the story. And I was like, can we talk about this and have these characters actually be shocked? Does that feel anachronistic and weird? And so like it was a really weird thing because I'm like, these guys would be hitting people all over the place, and I'm like, I don't want to tell that story. And so we decided like it's totally fine for Lenhart to be a piece of shit in every other way. We do not also need to bring up the topic of spousal abuse and beating children and like all this other shit. So I just said like that's not part of the story anymore. Like that's just not a story that we're telling here. Someone else wants to do it, I guess, but like I don't wanna, and nobody else on the team wanted to, so we made that choice. So yes, it's historically accurate, but again, we choose what we focus on and what we don't focus on, and that's kind of how we approached it.
And I think that falls within the bounds of like comprehensibility to modern sensibilities, because like you can't include that content without shaping directly how it's going to be seen. And I think that was definitely like a good call. And similarly, I think you've kind of answered the follow-up question, because the attempt at, if not historical accuracy, then a certain kind of verisimilitude in how it kind of comes across, but seems to have aided its impact for a lot of people who are familiar with like the area in place, which is awesome. Like I can't think of a higher compliment to receive, honestly, for the work that's been put in.
Yeah.
So I guess this is kind of where we kind of talk a bit like less about Pentiment and more about art and video games as a kind of lens of history, because, you know, obviously Pentiment is far from the first game to give a portrayal of historical times and place. And like we were kind of tossing ideas around and going, so what games do we think have kind of touched on history that are like cultural touchstones in modern society? And off the top of our heads, we were like, okay, there's a few big blockbuster titles that busy themselves with history. And there's like the Call of Duty series, which we're going to talk about, and like other big franchises like Assassin's Creed, and in a different way, kind of like Civilization. And, you know, we were kind of thinking that while Pentiment obviously offers an answer to this question, and we'll get into it later, but more broadly, what do you think art owes to its audience and to the people of the past when it offers a depiction of history? And does it owe anything to them?
I don't think it owes anything to anyone, but I do think that you can't really abdicate responsibility. Which is to say, when you portray something, again, there's nothing neutral about, just like what I was saying, like I am choosing to tell a story about 16th century Germany or Holy Roman Empire where we don't really bring up spousal abuse and child corporal punishment. I'm making that choice. And I'm conscious of that and aware of that. I do think this idea, not that everyone promulgates it, but like the people who are like, well, this is just history like it happened. It's like, step off. Like you're doing this, like you're choosing to write about this place and this time and these people and to focus on these interactions, and you're picking all of this. You're telling a story, and you're choosing not only what to talk about, but what not to talk about and how to talk about it, how to frame it. And, you're that author, and you're not the idea of the historical record as a thing that is known definitively, that is transmitted neutrally, is just that is in itself a fiction. And so you don't owe anyone anything, but you are the author and the agent of that thing. You're choosing your own version of history to tell and transmit, and you have to be very aware of what you're doing and what you're communicating and not communicating to people.
So it's more of on your own conscience be it. If that is that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like how that feeds exactly into what you actually do in the game. Like when you're choosing what to put in the mural at the end, or even when you're just working on the other pieces of art earlier on with Andreas.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's why we introduce that whole concept in the scriptorium when he's working on the Book of Hours, where Andreas is kind of like, because to be honest, a lot of the thoughts about art are very, very contemporary thoughts about them.
Yes.
They're not really thoughts that probably would have necessarily, I mean, who knows, but like their art was done in a particular way. And yes, during the Northern Renaissance, there were things that were being done that were pioneering, and that's great. But if you're illustrating a Book of Hours, and you're doing the calendars, there's kind of a way that you do it. Like each month shows a certain thing, and that's kind of that's what the client wants. That's what they expect, and that's what we see over and over in most of these manuscripts. There are exceptions, but mostly you have a job to do. You know what you're supposed to do, and you do it. And Piero is kind of saying like, hey man, but that's not the way things are anymore. Like things have changed, and you choosing to portray this even though you know it's not real, that's on you. And yes, someone paid you to do it, but you're still being complicit in it.
I'm reminded, I mean, this is a much less kind of politically fraught version of it, but I'm reminded of the fact that in Australia, where Christmas falls during the summer months, there's still like a lot of appetite for depictions of Christmas as being snowy and white, which doesn't fit at all with the underlying reality, but it's what people expect to see, right?
Santas with surfboards, things like that.
Well, I mean, it's also in terms of art and artwork, even today, I think a lot of artists and friends of mine who have gone to art school and are serious about their craft, even they, to put bread on the table, not unlike Pentiment, is you take commission work and you take things, people ask you to do art for certain corporate installations, or they ask for certain things to be drawn and made, and you don't get a choice in that either. Like, I don't think even now you can't say, look, art is now it's free to be sure, but it's not free of basic imperatives even now.
We do in fact live under capitalism, and you do in fact need to survive.
Well, I mean, just if I could elaborate on that, I mean, a lot of this also came out of my experiences growing up. My father, he's retired now, but he, for most of his adult life, worked as a freelance bronze sculptor, which is not an easy living in southern Wisconsin, in the American Midwest. And I'm not going to exaggerate and pretend we were impoverished, but we were poor, and we struggled, and we had to move around a lot because we couldn't make rent. And my dad had very clear artistic visions about the things that he wanted to do. And when he achieved those things, he was very thrilled. And when those things did not sell, it did not go well emotionally or financially. And my dad is a very, very opinionated person. And the way he interacts with clients, sometimes I was like absolutely floored. Like, I mean, he's one of those guys who's like, I'm the artist. Like, I decide. And I'm like, I don't know if you actually do, Dad. But I mean, he, like sometimes he got his way and sometimes he did not, and sometimes he lost jobs. And so growing up, like seeing that, that's real. I mean, like that was a real thing that I lived through, obviously vicariously through my dad. But that reality of, my dad would take jobs. He did the bronze fawns, which is crazy because like it's a pop culture thing, but people love it. And some people think it's like there was actually a big fight in Milwaukee, which is where the bronze fawns went up, because a lot of the artists there thought it was, really crass and vulgar and, tacky or whatever. But the thing is, it's by far the most popular piece of artwork he's ever done, because people love the fawns.
Yeah.
And so people like if you go and look up the bronze fawns on Google Images, you're going to find tons and tons of pictures of people standing next to the bronze fawns with a thumbs up, smiling. And so it's so weird. Like, in the meantime, he made, in the 80s, I remember he made a bunch of sculptures of Erté, the Russian French artist Erté made a bunch of he was an Art Deco artist, and my dad made sculptures of women based off of Erté paintings, and they're fantastic. They're some of the most beautiful sculptures that my dad ever made. But in the 80s, he's making what are essentially, in today's money, it's probably like $8 or $9 or $10,000 bronze sculptures of these beautiful little, like Art Deco women. They're like, a foot long or a foot high. Like, there's not a big market for that in southern Wisconsin. And so it was rough. It was rough seeing him pour his heart into these things that I thought and still think are beautiful, but like, you got to make a living, and that was rough. So anyway, there's a lot of that goes into my conception of Andreas as a working artist and the sort of, and myself as a person making games for an audience, like making choices and accepting my limitations or not accepting them.
I was actually sort of thinking to ask, like, how much, because it really did come across to me that this is a game by Josh Sawyer.
It's true.
And I did sort of wonder how much of yourself you saw in Andreas. And obviously you sort of say about your father, and you sort of see him feeding through as well. And like, so I just wondered how much of yourself, personally, that you actually think in Andreas.
I think a fair amount. One of the other big inspirations, because I bring up Name of the Rose because it's a little more maybe understandable or accessible. But Andrei Rublev is also another big inspiration, especially for the overall structure of the game. And Andrei in the film is a fiction. So Andrei Rublev is a fictionalized life story, essentially, not like most of the life story of this Russian Orthodox icon painter. And it's one of my favorite films, and it spans a long period of time, and it's broken up into these chapters where, in a Tarkovsky fashion, like sometimes nothing happens and sometimes crazy things happen. And but you see the central character really go through a whole life as an artist, which I thought was really fascinating. And you see him really struggle with his own faith and with his art and his friendships. And I remember Tarkovsky said, even though Tarkovsky's life is not really like Andrei Rublev's, he said that it's the closest thing that he made to being an autobiography. And I would say that that's the same for me in Pentiment. Like, is my life really like Andreas's? No. But I would say in terms of like how I thought about my craft as a young man and how that changed and kind of became a little cynical and kind of burned out as I approached middle age and then tried to work through it, I would say that that's very much the same. So yeah, I mean, it's hard because it's not really an autobiography, but if anything, the closest any game I've worked on could come to an autobiography, it's Pentiment.
That's really fascinating.
Well, I mean, for Pentiment 2, you just need to get Andreas on a bike, right?
True. There is actually a kind of on the nose thing where Andreas talks about the Church of Our Lady and the altar in Act 2. He's like, I really don't want to go back to Nuremberg, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's family reasons and grief and all this other stuff, but he also talks about a mural that he's supposed to make, and that it initially had a few patrons, and then it got more and more patrons, and in a very Renaissance fashion, they all want to be included. And it becomes logistically like really difficult to even conceive of how it's going to be done, and he's very tired of kind of dealing with that. And he's kind of like, it's very successful, but also this is not fun to work on. And there's a little bit of working on a crowdfunded game in there. Yeah. Like, when you have a lot of people who've contributed money, you have to be grateful for the fact that you wouldn't be able to do this thing if they didn't give you the money. But it becomes really hard to work your artistic sensibilities around theirs and their desire to be included. And it's a thing that you said that they could do. And that can be exhausting, even though, again, I'm grateful that it was able to be done. But there were times where it was just like, man, I really wish I didn't have to deal with this. So yeah, there's that as well.
And shout out and much love to our patrons. We all love you. Thank you for listening.
Still not taking your suggestions though. Like, leave them at home. Bye.
But yeah, no, that there's a lot to relate to in any creative process where you're like beholden to someone. And yeah. I do kind of wonder, because obviously we don't want to make this just like the Pentiment episode, but obviously Pentiment I think is the best distillation I've come across anyway of a lot of these issues of like, history and its influence and how it is retold. what I'm curious about is we look at like the mainstream, and particularly we're going to talk about a little bit about the Call of Duty franchise, because that's an interesting franchise in its relationship to history. You know, just even to go kind of recently, there was Modern Warfare remake with the Highway of Death, which attributed it to the Russians rather than to the Americans. There was the Call of Duty game that had to play or take a role in the assassination of it was nailed on Soleimani. You know, a lot of the kind of historical retelling and redefinition of what we can see in just recent record actually happened is being redefined and retold. And partly you have to look at it and go, well, the Department of Defense helps with Call of Duty's development, and as I believe they fund some portions of it, or at the very least supplement it through advisors and similar. And so there's this whole question of like how much of these games is defined by the paycheck which is ultimately being written for them. And I guess to kind of kick us off, because this is a bit of a kind of open topic really, it's does this speak to an underlying problem with the ethics of using historical events of, say, mass slaughter and like World War and all the rest of it to entertain audiences? Can there be such a thing as like mindless fun derived from these kind of sources? And I don't know, this is not a like leading question. Just generally, it's something we've been kind of kicking around recently.
I mean, yeah, I think it's very questionable. I think that when you are using things that are especially within living memory, you have a much stronger responsibility to be honest about what you're doing, and also understand that there's going to be a lot of people that are like, yo, dude, like either I was literally there or there's this, and of course we have so much more information and recording devices and things like that. Like, we can debate about like, we can look at Shakespeare and read Holinshed's account of the Battle of Agincourt and how that's pretty ahistorical and very biased towards Lancastrian propaganda and Tudors and all that stuff. But also there's like very little archaeological evidence. So we're kind of comparing written records and trying to piece together something. With something like the Highway of Death, it's not like there's a shortage of information that we can use to say like, well, what really happened? So it gets a little more silly and implausible and kind of ridiculous when it's rewritten so blatantly. When, I mean, you had like, what was it, David Frum, who was kind of like trying to pretend like he wasn't like complicit in, kind of the whole lie of getting rolling with WMDs and the Iraq War. And it's like, dude, we were all here. Like, your articles are still up. Like, we can reference them. What are you doing? It just seems extra silly. So I think, with these very proximal, events, it becomes a little more absurd and a little more ridiculous. And both, entertainment, like, Top Gun is another. So I just watched Top Gun Maverick, and not to go too far away from games, but it's a similar issue where you have, American military contributing materially to how this is made. And there's a very weird, vague, like, the enemy is not named ever. Like, you never see the people ever. It's this kind of neutral, like, it was very entertaining. I was like, this is really a thrill ride. And also, like, the script I thought was well written, but also I'm like, it's really conspicuous how weird the unnamed enemy is, and also there's a fundamental thing here where we just kind of accept, again, and I think this is very common, we accept like some people can have uranium, like refined uranium, and some people can't. Are never going to discuss it. It's just a thing. And we're never ever ideologically going to go into why the United States gets to decide that this unnamed state or group of actors, whatever, they can't have it. We just say, we don't want them to have it. We're going to blow them up. And we're never going to look underground and see that there's like 1,000 people working here when it gets fucking bunker busted. We're just going to let that roll right around our brain and watch Jennifer Connelly and Tom Cruise make out. So it's very weird because, like, you didn't accidentally do that. You didn't accidentally file, like sand all the serial numbers off of everything, so you have this generic enemy to tell your military story about. It's very weird. And yeah, all the, like, man, and I know it's told, like, because people are always like, dude, it's in a joking context, but it's so bizarre. And I know this is now an old thing, but like, McNamara as like a playable character, I'm just like, that's so wild and so crazy. But then later, you know, Call of Duty was like, what if you're hanging out with Reagan and doing debriefings with him? And I'm like...
And eating the jelly beans.
Yes, what if that? Yeah.
Like, what if, man? Like, can we not? Like, why are we doing this?
Man,
it was just so
these
weird.
guns are so perfectly detailed, and like, I can only assume the rest of the game is exactly as accurate as these weapons are.
I do think that like gaming in a certain context has like an interesting extra layer of maybe not responsibility, but because it's an interactive medium, and I can't help but think famously of the press F for respecting, which is now of course the meme, but you know it's. But it's the
immortalized forever. That fucking that is video game history right there.
Yeah, but you know, and what you were saying earlier about like the decision not to include spousal abuse is I sometimes think about, especially when you're talking about these sort of war shooters, World War I or II, or any of the Call of Duty franchise, really is it has to be, there has to be a gameplay loop. It has to be not just narrative. It has to be interesting and challenging and fun in a way. And I wonder if that sort of creates like an extra pressure and a sort of estrangement from telling history as it is, especially for these like sort of larger blockbuster kind of projects.
Oh, I would imagine. I mean, you know, it's, you know, to a certain extent, even in something like Fallout New Vegas, regardless of your faction choices, we always have, and you know, this is certainly something you can criticize, there's always raiders, essentially. There's always people that we kind of say like, these guys are just fucking crazy. Like, they're so goddamn crazy, they're just hostile, and you look at them and you're like, you look like Road Warrior people, and you're going to try to murder me, and so I can just kind of endlessly turn you into flying piles of body parts, and
yeah, these are
that's okay.
They're the barbarians from Civilization. So.
Yeah, they're the barbarians, and we're like, they're just, why are they so crazy? I don't know. They're raiders. Like, that's kind of just the way they are.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, like, purely as a gamer, like, I don't want to, you know, have a moral quandary about every single person I stab in the neck when I'm playing Assassin's Creed, you know?
Yes, and you know what? It's again, I feel like you don't necessarily have to dismiss it, but you do have to acknowledge it. You know, I remember, God, what was it? Was it Ninja Gaiden 3? Where it kind of did this, I only saw videos of it, I didn't play it, but I think it did this kind of weird thing where it was like, sometimes when you fucking cut a guy's legs off, he like lies on the ground and cries for his mom, and I'm like, do I need this in Ninja Gaiden? I don't know.
Ninja Gaiden Soldier of Fortune, yeah, it's fantastic.
What you really need is for Cicero to appear to you in a vision and to say, are you sure you should be doing this? Is this the moral thing to be doing?
So yeah, I don't know, but I mean, like, yeah, like sometimes, again, I can watch Top Gun and I can say, Josh can say, hey, we're really gliding around some shit that's a little silly, but I can also say that was a really entertaining movie. Well, maybe it's better than watching, you know, like Rambo 3, where shout out to the brave Mujahideen fighting against the Soviets, our eternal enemy, until they're not. Like, maybe it's better. I don't know. I think it's complicated, but I do think that you have to, as someone making these games, even if you say, like, yeah, we want the player to be able to kind of just chop people up and blow their heads off, and we accept that we're going to kind of categorize them in this way to make you not feel awful while doing it, if that's what you want to go for.
I guess this prompts a question, because, you know, so we're talking about like Call of Duty and these kind of style of games, which are dealing with like semi-contemporary, like, you know, political events where we can literally go this you in the replies to people when they try and contextualize it. But like in comparison, you've got games like Assassin's Creed and the Plague Tale games, which kind of lean heavily on historical trappings but are very clearly fantasy. And so I guess there's a question of, is there a difference between games that use history as a backdrop to tell a fantastical story and games that are more more grounded in the period we examine? Is it a difference in terms of like intent, or is it a difference in terms of like, you know, the kind of naked propaganda value of it that changes the burden that's on like the authors, do you think?
I do think it does change the burden. I think when you retell an actual thing, like this is how it happened and how the dude or the lady or the people did it in this way, and this is how they, like, that's a lot. Like I was thinking about, Assassin's Creed, you know, it kind of gives you the greatest hits of historical personages, but it's not really about those events. It's using it as a backdrop. Not quite in the same way as Pentiment, but sorta. Like, you know, there's a fiction here, and that fiction is even more fictional than Pentiment's fiction.
I did miss the on-rail shooter in the middle of Pentiment where you got to shoot arrows with Martin Luther.
So you know, you're gonna hang out with Leonardo and miss a bro hug if you don't do the prompt, and you know you're gonna do things in these places, but like the stuff you're doing, it's not like. Actually, well, I'm saying this, but I don't know. Maybe they have, but like, you know, you're not shooting JFK. You're not like part of that. You're on the edges of these things while they happen.
Could you imagine?
No, geez, I don't know, man. So you're part of history, but you're not part of the main events, and you're not retelling all that stuff. You're on the sides of it, and I think that like I said, it makes it easier. It made it way easier for me on Pentiment, but it allows you to tell your own story and make your own fiction while still being true to. There is a lot of value to just quote unquote being the trappings, because if the trappings are really, really well grounded, you can learn a lot about from that. You can convey a lot of things about life and people and interactions and the material reality in which they lived, which I think is very critically important. Got to throw in some Marxism there. But like understanding that is important, and so even if it's a fiction in there, there's a lot of value to it. And I do think that when you're like, no, this is literally the event, and you're really in it, and you're really doing this stuff, it gets trickier. Even in books like, you know, the Bernard Cornwell, the Sharps series.
Yeah.
Like Sharp is part of the Peninsular Wars, and he interacts with historical people. But it's also a fiction, and it's basically swashbuckling. And so he's there when cool things happen, but it's not like, it's a fiction on its own. And so there's not a lot of people who are going to read that and be like, Napoleon wouldn't have done whatever. It's like, well, yeah, he's not really the part of the story, dude.
Yeah, the difference between a story that's like, say, about Joan of Arc versus a story which Joan of Arc features in, but is really about this other cool, you know, video game protagonist tooling around.
Exactly.
Cool.
My favorite.
I just want to. Sorry, go on, Rob.
Sorry, my favorite bit of an Assassin's Creed historical weirdness is that in Valhalla you play a Viking, and like you can raid monasteries for like loot, and you're heavily incentivized to do so, and you can run around with a big axe and like hacking guards in the head and all that. But then the moment you put your axe into like one unarmed monk, the game goes, I'm sorry, it is not allowed to kill civilians.
Desync.
I'm like, but what am I doing? Like
that's more cultural, you know, contemporary cultural sensibilities, providing like a kind of a content filter that's kind of insurmountable, particularly with like the ESRB rating and all the rest of it. Surely,
I was going to bring up there as well. Does anyone actually remember there was a game where you had to shoot JFK?
Yes.
Oh yeah. JFK Reloaded. That was the whole game.
You had to like try and accurately. Was there a cash? Am I remembering right that there was a cash prize if you managed to simulate the exact conditions of the incident?
So I
don't remember that. I just remember it was really
right.
notorious, and people were going wild about it.
So, you know, supposedly there was a cash prize, but it was all just like the guy shitposting, essentially, is what we call it today. But yeah, no, he did say a cash prize to anyone who can reproduce the shot.
Peter Molyneux joint, was it?
Just clicking through to get to JFK's brain. Sure, yeah, awesome.
All this talk of Assassin's Creed just makes me think more games should allow you to pal around with Karl Marx.
Oh no, I mean, God.
Have there been any games that have allowed you to? Really?
Yes, Assassin's Creed Syndicate has Karl Marx in it.
Wait, which one? Syndicate?
Syndicate, yeah.
And wow.
It's the one that no one played, because then they did Odyssey, and they said, for the first time you can choose between a male and a female character. It's like, no, you didn't. You did that in the last game, but nobody played it. I did. But, okay. There's a lot wrong with me.
Actually, there's a really interesting counterpoint, right? Because we're saying if it's not really about the person, it doesn't matter. But Karl Marx's portrayal in Syndicate is really problematic. He straight up contradicts the political philosophy of actual Karl Marx in his dialogue to the players, and urges reconciliation with bigger forces when he was very much not about that. And that's interesting. Does that, when it's a political figure, is it different necessarily? Do we owe more fidelity to the views and opinions of political figures in history when we portray them? I don't know.
I guess, yeah, I do think, like I said, if you're going to use those great figures of history, I do think that if you're making choices about how to portray them and what they're doing and what they're talking about, like with Leonardo in Assassin's Creed 2, it's really light, and you don't really get very deep into him, and he doesn't I don't remember him saying anything where you'd be like, whoa, that doesn't sit well with his notebooks. He would never say that. Whereas with someone like Marx, where it's no, dude, there's literally entire books about this is exactly what I believe. Then it's a little weirder. It's a little weirder when he's
famous book, you may have heard of it.
But really, not actually. That's where it kind of gets a little silly, and it depends on how they're included and how they're represented. But I do think, when it's kind of actually, we're going to portray this person in a way that is completely dissimilar to everything we know about how they lived. Because obviously there's also a difference. People can be very hypocritical, but unless there's some really reason to think oh yeah, Marx actually, this was a big ruse and he loved capitalism, then that's a little silly and ridiculous.
Yeah.
I'm picturing a Call of Duty where they include Karl Marx somehow. I think they could absolutely pull it off. It would be no less ridiculous than some of the things they're getting away with.
Honestly, I've been wondering, they've got Call of Duty Future Soldier, right? I think I'm waiting for this Call of Duty time travel kind of thing for that very reason. The dastardly Soviets have invented time travel, and you must time travel to stop them from distorting history.
Can you imagine Red Alert but played completely straight?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
Oh man. So
we talked about these very on the nose, it's centered, you can see it straight away, but there is a subtler level to the political subtext of games and its reproduction, because an unintuitive example is Civilization, which people look at and they go, well, okay, the inclusion of certain leaders is problematic, etc. But ignoring that, Civilization has kind of baked into its core these kind of Western narratives of development and discovery. There's a linear tech tree, progress through the ages, there's a primitivism versus advancement, there's the barbarians that we've literally talked about. And I guess the question is, are these sort of default political assumptions that find their reproduction in art, are they just a fact of life of every age? Is that just something we always have to contend with? Or is it something that is on some level, a more deliberate and more kind of worth investigating kind of decision on the part of designers, do you guys think?
Well, I think that we kind of do things the way that we learn them initially, or we see them before we start examining them critically. And the more we do it, maybe the more we go oh, wait, why am I doing things this way? And especially when things are mechanized, when there's a mechanical thing to in most games, progress and the growth of power are things you try to do, and that's good. And therefore, whether it's tech trees in AoE or Civilization or something, then you're portraying the passage of time and the development and the changes of culture in a fashion that is oriented around the mechanization of progress. So of course there's going to be difficulties if that's not what you're trying to actually portray, because that's mechanically what's happening. So I think a lot of it is it's unexamined. I would say it's unexamined, or it's examined and ultimately decided this is the sort of gameplay that we want, and it is problematic, but it does work mechanically and narratively, even though it's reinforcing things that people have reasonable issues with.
Yeah, and so it's kind of leaned on to provide a framework that lets players kind of grasp things quickly and simplifications that allow to be a more a more interactive experience, whereas the reality is perhaps messier.
Yeah, I mean, games tend to sort of work on competition rather than, especially something like Civilization. I think I've got a vague inkling we might have covered this on the last episode Josh was here for, but the thing that always strikes me is that the later Civ games have like an option where you can win through world peace. You can have like a diplomatic victory, but it's still your victory. You have to be voted to. Like the rest of the civilizations have to vote for you as the best guy, and then you win. You can't just have one where, because obviously if you had one where, well, everybody wins, there'd be an incentive to just sort of pick that. And it makes me think of the debate recently about is the communist meta too strong in Victoria 3?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where people were like, well, I just left my society just doing something overnight, and everyone was like ready to murder each other when I came back. Why does capitalism require like endless growth? That sort of thing.
It's definitely kind of it's an interesting thought, and I guess there is that whole kind of thing where at the end of the day, we're all kind of stuck with these kind of implicit kind of biases, and unpicking them is a lot of work on an individual level, let alone trying to get someone else. Like, you know, if it was easy to get someone to re-examine their fundamentals, there'd be a lot more Marxists in the world, right? When you really kind of come to it. And I suppose there's only so much that can be expected of like an artistic kind of property, let alone, you know, video games that are under like intense, like often competing corporate pressures. So I suppose at the end of the day, maybe it is kind of, it's a necessary factor in the kind of material reality we live in. Like, I mean, we're just going to be subject to these pressures, and until we get rid of capitalism, there's nothing you can really do about that.
I think you can't really rely on the player to sort of necessarily to examine what it is they're doing. I know like some games specifically try to confront you with like your actions with varying degrees of success.
Shout out to Spec Ops for lying.
Yeah, but certain things like I think the Call of Duties are relying on the fact that the average player is not gonna question, like sort of consider the frame. In fact, I think a lot of the appeal to like maybe the Department of Defense in helping with those games is not just that the players won't sort of question the narrative they're being presented, but that by like they'll actually take some ownership of it. And then if someone in the future tries to tell them, oh, like the Americans committed this, like, you know, atrocity, on some level they'll think, well, no, that's not right. I was there, you know, I went through this, and it was definitely the Russians that did it.
Call of Duty has created a new generation of boomers. We've done it.
Yeah, I killed Soleimani, therefore he was a bad guy. Like,
all the British people who were definitely at Dunkirk.
Ronald Reagan is real, and he's my friend.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really astute observation, Jamie, and one that hadn't occurred to me if I'm really candid. Yeah, cool.
So I do think. Sorry.
No.
I was just going to say, I do think with a lot of this stuff, I think the conversations around it would go a lot better if more people could just acknowledge it and say, yeah, I made this choice. I think it has, not to go too far off topic here, but like it's kind of like the Nepo baby discussions where people who clearly benefit from nepotism get incredibly defensive and weird about it.
Yeah.
And really, it's no one's, well, maybe some people are saying like throw yourself in a ditch, but like they're just acknowledge that that's what happened and that you benefited from it, and that it would have been much more difficult if you did not have the connections that you did, and that it is not fair, and that it's much more difficult for other people. Like, we're always going to have to deal with some unfairness in life and how we live and grow and all that sort of stuff, but it's infuriating when people just say, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not real. No, I don't think it's actually a problem. It's like, come on, man. Like, just acknowledge that you're making this choice and you understand that it reinforces certain things and you made it for these reasons because the game really just wouldn't do the things that you want it to do mechanically or narratively if you don't make those choices, and then we can move on instead of bullshitting each other about, like, what you did. Like, you know what you did. Just come clean about it, and then we can be adults.
in counterpoint, Josh, if you admit that you got there from a position of privilege and that life is unfair, doesn't that behoove you to maybe consider perhaps doing something to make it less unfair? I don't know about that.
Yeah, well, that would be the next step, which is great. But if you can't get to the first step, you're not going to get to the second.
I feel like Josh is going to end up with half of the fucking British press in his mentions.
It's okay. We're not talking about trans issues. He's fine.
Yeah. Well, Josh, what do you think of Prince Harry?
I actually saw someone today, just some guy on a forum today, passionately defending Nepo babies because in the initial wave of stuff, someone pointed out that Timothy Chalamet, is it, from Dunk?
Yeah.
His uncle directed Leprechaun 2. And someone was saying that is just ridiculous. Like, how, and it's like, yeah, okay, so Leprechaun 2 is not a huge blockbuster or anything, but that's still a family connection to people in the movie industry. It's not nothing. But like I say, I mean, that's just that to the best of my knowledge, that's not Timothy Chalamet's forum account. That's just someone put out because their fave is being like not even really attacked, but people are just going, like, here is a thing that you might not know, and everyone's just outraged because
this is very defensive. They're just very defensive.
Yeah.
Get over it.
So we're coming on to the back part of the podcast, and we did want to do like some discussion on the particulars of Pentiment, which gets into kind of spoilers for the story. So I don't know, Jamie, are you wanting to head off to play Pentiment then, or?
Yeah. Yeah, I am actually going to go and cane it because I'm on the edit for this, so I've got basically,
right, well, damn,
I've got 24 hours to finish the game, otherwise I'm going to spoil it.
Time starts now.
The clock's on.
Yeah, so listen, if you're tuning in on Saturday, this is why that happened.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure as always, Josh. Thanks for coming on, and I'll catch everyone else next week.
Thank you so much.
All right,
Grand. Catch you, Jamie.
Catch you later, Jamie.
So obviously at this point onward, spoiler warning, if you have not completed Pentiment, we're going to be talking about its themes with particular reference to things that develop in the plot and asking Josh about like how this came together. So now is your get out point, and just to reiterate, it's a very good game. So if you think you might play it at all, I would really strongly recommend, don't listen to us, go play it and then come back. You'll enjoy the conversation more. So all of that out of the way, I guess it's kind of like there's a lot going on in Pentiment, and you touched on it at the start with kind of some of the broad themes. If it's all right, can I played it last night, and so I've slept on it and I've had a bit of time to think about it. Can I give a short summary of what I think it's got, what is kind of ideas in it, the thesis of it is, if you will, and then we can maybe kick off from there and just kind of explore it a bit. Would that work for you, Josh?
Sure.
Okay, so like obviously the clue's in the title. For the benefit of our listeners who don't know, Pentiment is the anglicization of another term from Italian, pentimento. Full disclosure, I did not actually know this. It's a literal term of art. But I was familiar with the underlying idea of it, which is that historically in development, particularly of oil paintings, you would have the painter would midway through kind of change directions, alter composition, make corrections, and these would be contained in the canvas but obscured by the layers above. And in, over time, as colours faded, as varnishes warped, you would start to get hints of the original composition or the earlier image. And it doesn't apply, like, if an artist, like, painted a painting and then completely painted another one over the top of it on a different subject, it's not Pentiment. Pentiment is this idea of the development of a single idea or subject and its changes and iterations over time. And so taking that, it would be my guess, as a metaphor for and a summation of what's going on in the text, it's talking about essentially the social reproduction of ourselves and our history, both in terms of, we're continually retelling the past and reinterpreting it and building layers upon it, but the process of doing so is also establishing a base on which the future itself will in turn build. And the game has a real strong kind of ludonarrative kind of cohesion where you spend the game very literally trying to figure out what has happened. At the earliest levels, just like with, the murders, you're constantly looking back and going, what actually materially happened here? And often finding that, and I think this is quite, speaks to the cleverness of it, there's not necessarily a true answer. A lot of the time, there's only the answer that you as an author of history, and you're trying to understand it, get to impose upon it. And it gets into the kind of politicization and the socialization, the social factors, separate from political factors, that go into the shaping of history, and how ultimately, we bequeath to the future through artistic representation our understanding of ourselves, which is defined by what's been bequeathed to us by the past. And I'll just, to kind of summarize, I'd say it's by far one of the most human games I've ever played, in its genuine warmth and in its sensitivity to how it handles the characters and their families and the development across time. I honestly don't think I've played anything like it. I don't think any other game has quite had the same level of care and attention to the people. Like, it's not just history, it's people and their part in the reproduction of it. So
I also found it. Sorry, I just want to add. So the game takes place over like a 25-year time span, and it is quite. I did like how. You as Andreas Mahler are like essentially an outsider when you start, year zero, and then you meet these characters like Martin, for example, is the one that really stands out to me. He starts off as like he's like a ne'er-do-well who like sort of almost like layabout pretty much, and then as the game progresses, he's still like the same guy, but like he becomes more I found myself becoming more like almost enamored with him, like especially the.
This is really funny, Alasdair, because I didn't get through it, but I figured it out and then failed the dialogue checks. Josh, am I right in thinking it's not Martin later on? It's the guy he went on the banditry spree with, who's taken his life.
That is correct.
Yeah, it's not.
It's actually
Martin.
A different person.
Yeah.
Oh right.
And it is entirely possible to miss many. Yeah. I've actually seen many players who completely miss that. Martin Bauer is actually this guy named Jobst Ferber, who was his friend, who came back to take over his life.
Wow. Well, there you go.
That's why he seems so much nicer. And by the way, that's incredible. Based on a real historical thing that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It happened multiple times in history. It was possible to just pick up someone else's life. Still, identity theft still exists today, but it wasn't quite the same back then.
Yeah.
What was really interesting, actually, just this is kind of away from the broad kind of theme, but I did get the impression that was partly why he was so understanding of the implied lesbian relationship. Again, I didn't get deep into that. I didn't have the time in the narrative playthrough I was doing to really progress it, but I got the impression his wife was in a lesbian relationship with another woman, and he was very understanding of the whole thing, partly because I got the impression she knew that he wasn't who he claimed to be. Yeah. I found that whole thing just so beautifully like human, so very like I could picture people being that way. Across time and place. So yeah, anyway, I was originally asking, am I a million miles away, or is that kind of like part of the central thesis of what you were going for with Pentiment?
That's it. You got it.
Yeah.
I think that unlike any other game that I've worked on, I didn't literally write the dialogue for every character, but I designed every character. Every character that exists in the game is a character that I conceived of and wrote up their brief bio and how they relate to other people, and gave direction to the other writers if someone else wrote them, and what their arc would be. And that was to really make the feeling of a very strongly interconnected community of people, where you were really seeing them live out over a long period of time, and that would feel very genuine, and that the changes in the community would just feel, like you said, a lot warmer and more human. And the way that people interact with each other, like there's a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are several essentially same-sex relationships going on in different forms, and the ones that you can press on, generally speaking, people tell you to shut the fuck up. Like, they're like, who cares? Like, don't talk about that. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, stop. Because, the thing is, it's weird. It's like we've almost forgotten that until very, very recently, that's how things still worked. Where people kind of knew, like, yeah, this guy is gay and we kind of all know it, and like maybe people are shitty about it and maybe they're not, but generally people just don't talk about it because it's socially unacceptable, but we love this person and they live next to us and they're part of our lives, and we don't want them to suffer, even if at some level we have these reprehensible, judgmental beliefs about them. They're part of my life, and so shut the fuck up.
Yeah, the leave
not
them
going to
alone
talk about
theory.
it. Yeah, and like and so I and the same thing with Martin, where Martin, you know, or Jobst basically, you know, he left a life behind where he killed somebody. Mm-hmm. Like I mean, you don't necessarily find out that detail when you find out he's an imposter, but in his hometown, he killed a man in a bar brawl, and he fucking murdered somebody, like, or manslaughter at the very least, I guess, technically. But like and then when Martin dies, he takes over his life, and he understands that he has really been given a second chance at life. And so he tries to be not only better than Martin was, but better than he was.
Yeah. And
he's very aware that Brigitte, his wife, his adopted wife, has a relationship with Veronica, and he's just like, okay. Like
there's a bit on the Common Green where he makes a joke about it and she goes quiet, and then he apologizes to her in a really sincere way, and I was like, that was the moment where I was like, this is an incredibly well realized kind of interaction and dynamic between these characters. So like, hats off, genuinely was quite impressed.
Yeah, my moment with Martin was, Jobst, was when he said that some arseholes just need their teeth pounded in, and that really resonated.
Oh yeah. And like it was fascinating. Kind of, I'll be honest. My whole favorite sequence from Pentiment is the sequence where the Ethiopian priest, you can take him out for lunch basically with the local people, and all the women and their children show up, and you then get a very beautiful, artistically, like the art team, absolutely fantastic. Actually, little note: the person who drew the tiny owl above the salt well, not salt well. Could you please tell them that they gave me infinite joy with that drawing? And
everyone loves the baby owl.
Yeah, no, it's just so good. But no, genuinely, like the whole dialogue and explanation, and in particular the stealing of the hat you're wearing, and then what happens to the hat down through the years, just like that whole sequence to me felt like almost like the heart of Pentiment, if you will, in many ways. I don't know. It's just it's I can't see any other game that's not, unless it's like really niche and indie, and I don't know about it. And apologies if anyone's listening to this and they're thinking, well, I'm working on that art. Like it's certainly of the most prominent kind of titles that have been kind of talked about in recent years. I can't think of any other game handling that quite so sincerely and using it like it's a really good. It really does convey what the game's about by just doing. Like it just does it in front of you, and it's like you kind of get it over time. So
yeah, it was a real it was really great to do that whole sequence. To include Brother Sebhat and provide sort of a narrative hook for him through the Council of Constance, where there are records that Ethiopian monks were present there, and so to have this sense of there was a favor that was done in the past, and he's coming back to return that favor by presenting a Bible, and then he's showing it to the children who are kind of stunned and mystified by it, and you see it. So you initially see Sebhat looking different than everyone else, and not only different from everyone else, but different from everything around him.
Yes.
Because he is driven in the style of Ethiopian manuscripts, which has an extremely rich and long tradition.
Oh, it's just gorgeous.
And then when he tells the story, it's reversed, where all of the locals are now in his environment, where they are outnumbered by people who they look like Sebhat, and Sebhat is the one who fits in, and they all stand out. And the whole story is being told within the shrine of St. Moritz, and St. Moritz is portrayed as a black African in that time period, but he's illustrated as a black African through a European lens. So above Sebhat is this saint who is nominally Egyptian, but portrayed as a black African, but wearing European armor, portrayed in a European style. There's so many like different, and then the children even talk about why is everyone brown, and he's explaining like because people are different, and in different parts of the world they look different, and they don't look like you at all, and there are other places where they don't look like you or me, and that's how the world is. And she's like, wow, crazy.
What I really appreciated about it as well was just how well it was worked in. This didn't, Like, I think it really speaks to the heart of this game that it didn't feel like it stood out. It didn't feel like it was being dropped in. It felt like a natural, organic part of the development of what you were already doing. And it's a shame to me that you can miss it, honestly. I know players can, like, if they go for lunch with someone else, they won't get that. But it was genuinely, like, honestly very heartwarming. And yeah, just I cannot stress enough how impressed I was by how well you managed to take a narrative, making a point about reproduction, particularly in the central plot, which we'll get to in a minute, and yet in many ways, as you play the game, that becomes the background to the human point that's being made, and it just feels like such an antidote to the way history is used in most games, to be perfectly frank.
Thank you.
So speaking of like that central plot, so obviously the big reveal at the end is that the priest of the town has been coordinating the murders throughout, purely for the purposes of covering up the true history as he, comes to understand it, of where their saints came from, and he's afraid that this is going to, shake their faith. And you get the narrative, you get the dialogue option to counter him and say, I think you don't have faith in people to be able to understand and embrace this reproduction and change over time. Did you, so I have a question, which is, when you were sitting down to write this, did you always have in mind that it was going to be that particular priest that was going to be the villain in the end, or did that develop over the course of developing the characters?
I can only assume Josh just hates the church as much as I ended up hating the church at the end.
I don't really. I mean, I don't hate Catholicism. I do think that the institution has a lot to answer for, both in the past and right now. But Father Thomas and Amelie were always going to be sort of like the duo, with Thomas essentially manipulating Amelie and using her as both the actual author and the messenger of the notes. But Father Thomas is the exact like beef that he had and why he was doing it. That got shaped over time. It was like initially it was more like against modernity, and that over time I was like, and it didn't really hold up with the individual characters. And then eventually it came down to this idea of the portrayal of the saints. As the saints became more prominent within the culture of the town, and I realized that their background, but also so central to the town's identity and their faith as a community, that Father Thomas would see a threat to them and their identity as potentially a threat to the faith of the people. And so he decides, no, this is extremely important for me, whether or not that's realistic. And I wouldn't even say necessarily that Thomas's view is something that you should look at and be rational about, but it's also due to his own trauma from witnessing, a community go buck wild, and burn down an abbey that almost killed a bunch of nuns and almost killed Sister Amelie. So he has this oversized sense of responsibility to preserve the story, the Orthodox story of the way things happened and are, and that leads him to do these really extreme things.
It's the reason I asked the question, and that's kind of interesting when you talk about his development of his motives as you were writing, because when I was first playing through, I very early on I was like, is it Amelie? Because she's right at the centre of town, she's not moving around, and wouldn't, with the whole reversal and dramatic irony of literature, wouldn't that be interesting if she's the one who's secretly seeking out and going about? And I then kind of discounted it. I said, well, that might be a bit too on the nose. That I think that's too straightforward. My first pick, where I was thinking, could this turn out to be the manipulator, was I was thinking it might be Sister, I think her name was Illuminata.
Yeah.
And my reasoning for it is I thought, well, we're establishing that she's highly intelligent. She's a keen observer of people's behavior and is able to kind of, pick people apart quite well. She's very well read. I totally caught that when you're doing this handwriting is not in any, handwriting of any people we know can write. I'm sitting here going, yeah, you're excluding all the women from it. So, and she had direct access to the scriptorum and a lot of time on her hands because she was working in charge of the library. And so I was thinking, is it going to be her? And is her stated reason just going to be pure stability and this desire to kind of keep things as they are? Is it going to be a versus progress kind of narrative it develops, but more from a care from people? Because in the first chapter I was playing through it, I'm like, this very much seems like someone recognizes this guy is bad for the community And not only that, he's now talking about Lutheran ideas, which are, inherently going to be a bit destabilizing. Is this why he's been knocked off? Not for any particular thing, but because he represents this outsized influence on the community that's potentially maligned for it? Is that what's going on? And so it's interesting to me to hear that, like, you kind of pegged that, okay, it's going to be this guy, but his actual reasons about what it was he was trying to preserve were developed over time. And it's really fascinating to me. So I guess, like, I don't know, is there any part of the game and its narrative that you're particularly proud of that you look at and you go, you know what, I feel like this worked really well in execution, almost better than we'd kind of planned it?
I do think the sense of community, I think we did really well. There's a lot of inspirations that I had for this game, and one of them was there's a film called The Mill and the Cross, and it's about the creating of Bruegel the Elder's The Procession to Calvary, and it's a beautiful painting, and Rutger Hauer stars as the artist. And it's one of it, I think it was made like 10 years ago, maybe something like that, maybe 6 years ago. And it's a very slow paced, sort of ponderous film, but it's really beautiful. And there's a part early on where, because Mannerist paintings often had and that painting has so many characters. There are like hundreds of characters. And there's a point where in the film he says, my painting needs to be big enough to hold everyone, everything. And I was like, this game needs to be big enough to hold everyone and everything, which is a way of sort of saying, I want to show broad society. I want to show peasantry, and I want to show nobility and monks and nuns and printers and doctors and Romani tinkers and charcoal burners and executioners. And we want a lot of characters, and not just for the sake of having a lot of characters, but because it creates this really rich sense of society and how they interact, and gives you lots of different perspectives on life and religion and family and all those sorts of things.
And how they change each other. Definitely.
Yeah, and I thought in the end, I was most happy with how all of that came together. And if there's one thing I maybe regret, and I don't want to second guess it too much because the game critically did very well, is the decision to remove all the Benedictines in Act 3, because I'd wanted to show the replacement by the Poor Clares, because it's a reform movement and to kind of show progress and the change of time. But I do think that if we had kept just the nuns, for example, just like, Illuminata and Zedena and all of that, there could have been another interesting dimension, and also would have kept Illuminata in the running as the thread puller, which a lot of people immediately were like, well, she's not here anymore, so it can't be her.
Yeah, that's definitely me.
but like the way that the community worked and their relationship to it, and how people really felt like it felt like a real place, and the people felt like real people with very human flaws and virtues, and I think that's probably the best thing about it.
Well,
I think one of the things I really enjoyed was the way. So essentially, the text of the speech itself would change depending on what your perception of that person as the player/player character is. So, like when you're talking to Till about the Roman ruins and stuff, and you learn that Till can actually read and stuff, and it literally changes the typeface that you are reading his text in when you find that out. I thought was really great, and also like when the obvious one being when you find out that Amelie is the one that's got this incredible typeface on these notes that she's been leaving,
and it changes to purple. Yeah. It's definitely. I mean, there's a really good article which I think we'll put in the show notes, where I think there's a breakdown by the group which were doing the typefaces for you.
Yeah, Lettermatic.
Yeah, really, really quite beautiful stuff. So, I guess, so for kind of final question, because obviously, like this, as much as we're saying, this is Josh Sawyer presents a Josh Sawyer production, right? You said yourself that this is the work of many hands that have come together in support of this kind of vision you laid down. So I guess the final question would be, was there anything that came to it that you didn't initially conceive of, but that developed from your work with your kind of colleagues on this, that you think, was really, transformative, or that elevated the work? Was there like something they brought that you're like, man, I didn't envision it this way, and it's all the better for it?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone on the team contributed something that changed I have very strong opinions and ideas, and I push them, but even things that I really believe in very strongly, if people come back and they're like, dude, this is not it, it's not happening. There's like the way the persuasion mechanic works, and I still think we need to iron out a few bugs for how that works, but the way persuasion works in the game was more mechanically kind of mechanically raw, in that you saw numbers. And it was like a really weird and jarring feeling to suddenly see like +1, -2.
Yeah.
And so like a bunch of people were like we should hide all that. And I'm like, well, but I want players to understand that the choices that they made are impacting this. And they're like, yeah, but this feels really weird and jarring. And so we went back and forth until we came up with the colored pips up and down, where it's essentially still the same information, but it's just presented in a way that's not so, like I said, like jarring. And there's still work to do there, but it was because the people on my team were like, this is not doing it. The portrayal of certain characters, like Lenhart and what happened with him, my writing collaborators, we went back and forth on what to do with the Miller, Lenhart, and we were eventually like, this guy's gotta fucking die. Basically we're like, one of my writers said there is no way that anyone is going to be satisfied leaving Act 2 unless Lenhart Mueller is dead.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why things get railroaded through the mill. But at least it's narratively satisfying, even if it's a little implausible in ways. And then we had a lot of mini games where people on the team would, look at it and, they'd play it and they're like, this is really clumsy. This is really clunky. There's a lot of pacing things where people would play and they would say like, this really drags. This conversation is really long. Or, people would say like this character feels very similar to this other character. Is there a way we can differentiate it? And, the team, we were a very tight team. We started as it was just, Hannah and I. Hannah Kennedy is my art director. And then we added Kathy Nichols in animation, Alec Fry as a producer, and then Brett Kloster as our programming lead. But we eventually grew to 13 people, and it was almost entirely remote. And we stayed pretty close, and we communicated very well with each other, and we're very frank about issues we were having, and things got heated at times, but nothing wild. Certainly nothing compared to some of the meltdowns I've gone through on other projects. So overall, it was a very harmonious collaboration with all my teammates, and could not have done it without them, any of them.
Well, I guess it really does take a village, if you forget the pause.
I do have one more question for you, Josh.
Sure.
Preferred culprits for the two murders. I personally went for Ferenc and Guy, because those guys were arseholes. They had it coming.
Yeah, knowing mechanically, so there's some I guess it depends on if you're just going to throw someone to the wolves. Arguably, some more harm happens with Ferenc dying in the long run. This is metagaming, because if Ferenc dies, then Václav absolutely dies at the end of the game. He is burned at the stake in the mural. Yeah. However, if he lives, if Ferenc lives, he becomes an Inquisitor, and he will basically save Václav and or Ursula if Ursula also potentially would have been burned at the stake.
Oh, that's very obscure. I would have never guessed that.
Yes, and it comes down to the fact that Ferenc is very open-minded when it comes to beliefs, and he is an asshole. But the other thing, too, is if you leave Ferenc alive in Act 2, when you talk to him, he feels very bad about how things went. And he, especially if you didn't accuse him. If you didn't accuse him, he apologized to Andreas right away, and he's like, I'm sorry, I was he's like, it's not an excuse, but I was like under a lot of stress, and the Abbey was really suffering, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and I shouldn't have taken it out on you. I shouldn't have taken it out on the brothers. That was my fault, basically. So he does get better, even though it doesn't seem like it. So the person I think actually is the most likely to have been capable of doing it, in my mind, is Lucky in Act 1.
Yeah.
Because he has a really compelling reason.
Yeah.
He is not afraid about getting in. He's demonstrably not afraid about getting in the Baron's face, and he is clearly physically capable of doing it. I think probably the person that causes the least harm, and this is often what happened in societies, would be Attilia. Old women often were the ones who were like, well, she doesn't have any kids. Her husband's dead. Nobody likes her, so get rid of her. Yeah. And then in Act 2, I think it's a little less clear to me. I think that Guy is clearly the least likable person. Mm-hmm. I find it a little less likely that he would have actually murdered someone, even though he is a huge asshole. There also is a little tiny bit of redemption in him if you find out the reason, which a lot of people, it's very difficult to find out why he's embezzling money. Yeah, which is that, his background is his family. He's a Jewish convert, and his grandparents were like basically persecuted, and so he's stealing money to give to Jewish families that are being purged out of cities, basically.
Man, way to make me feel terrible about my choices in the game, man.
But he's still an asshole, and if you think he killed him,
and then I don't want to feel bad about playing a video game.
But then you have Hannah, who has material interest potentially in doing it. She is a little suspicious in that she was actually spending time around the Rathaus. I think she's kind of enigmatic about whether or not she did it. And then you have Martin, where I think he obviously has a ton to lose. I personally feel like he probably would not have done it, but again, there is no canonical thing. So it kind of all depends on how you go through it. Everyone was written as though they absolutely could have done it. Yeah. So it kind of comes down to really personal preferences, and I would never canonically say this is the person who did it, because that defeats the entire point of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just asking, if Josh were playing, who would Josh accuse?
Yeah, it's so weird because I played it so many times, and I've and of course when you have meta knowledge, that changes it a lot, because it's really easy to say Ference because he's so unlikable, and it's very easy to say Guy because he's so unlikable. But then when you know more meta context, then those choices become not so easy.
It's kind of it's very cool how in my experience anyway, and maybe others will obviously have a different experience of playing it, but as you play through it, by the time you're in the second act, you're almost kind of leaning into the idea that, I am doing the reproduction of history to achieve an end, and I've been primed and I've been told that there are influences and effects that will ripple out from my decision here, and we've seen it in Act 1, and now we're being asked to do it again, so it almost is like, okay, you had a trial run in Act 1, now you know the stakes, here's these other figures which are even more ambiguous in many ways. What do you want to do here? Are you going to try and get to the truth TM, or are you going to try and work out what would be best? And it's real. It's very well executed. So
thank you.
But anyway, enough gushing from me. I guess we've been talking for a while now, so we should probably kind of wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming on, Josh. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me again. I love being a guest.
Yeah, thank you for coming on this communist podcast, as I think we were referred to last time you dropped by.
we will absolutely have you on again, to talk about your other work. Which, speaking of which, are there any up and coming projects or similar that you're involved in that you'd like to highlight to our audience?
No, I mean, nothing right now. I mean, I am still working on the Pillars of Eternity tabletop role-playing game,
nice.
Which has been was sidelined at the end of Pentiment because it was just too much. But we're making we also have a virtual tabletop version of that, so you can play the game online, and it's actually a really robust implementation. So if you play like with Foundry as a virtual tabletop, it's pretty cool. It still has a lot of work to go, but that is what I'm working on. I'm helping out on other projects at Obsidian that are currently in development, but I have a while before I need to figure out the next thing that I'm going to direct, which is good because I don't know what I want to do because now that I made a D&D game, more than a D&D game. I made many D&D games. I made a Fallout game, and I made a historical game, which were the 3 games that in 1999 I wanted to make. So now I can do something else.
Big budget shooter.
Maybe.
Finally made his masterpiece and can go off, get married, and become a master.
Yeah. There we go.
And I look forward to you directing the next Call of Duty game. Clearly, like that's got to be the direction.
Where you can pal around with Karl Marx.
Well, it's funny you should say that because the when I was doing research on the game, I watched an interview with Umberto Eco from about 10 years ago, and he wrote Name of the Rose when he was 48.
Yeah.
And it was his first novel. He had obviously written a lot of academic work prior to that. But that was his first novel. And he said something like, yeah, I turned 48, and that's the age at which either you run away from life with a Cuban ballerina or you write a novel. So I chose to write a novel. And I was like, I'm 47. Is that the decision that I have coming in the next year? I don't know if that's if I can do that.
You'll get a letter in the mail. Don't worry.
Yeah.
And like I said, look, if you wanna come stay here in Switzerland, your ballerina is welcome as well. Don't worry about it.
Fantastic.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's it from us. We hope you all enjoyed this episode. Play Pentiment. It's really good. And we'll catch you all again next time.
We'll be back next week with more British things, which will be horrible and depressing.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it already. All right. Bye from us all.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.